Thanks for having me on.
So the Bible has lots of references to herbs. Some are very specific, frankincense, myrrh. Some are very generic. And you contend that at least some of those generic references to herb is cannabis?
Well, specifically, as far as cannabis is concerned, I think what we have to do is go back to the Old Hebrew for the Old Testament references. And an anthropologist writing in the 1930s, Sula Benet, pointed out two Hebrew words, Keneh and Keneh Bosem, which she said were references to cannabis.
These are Hebrew words.
Hebrew words. And what had happened is in 300 BC, roughly, when the Hebrew texts were translated into Greek, these references were mistranslated as calamus. And this mistranslation followed through in later translations of the Bible down to the King James and down to modern times. But when you look at these references in the context of the biblical storyline and you place cannabis in them instead of calamus, it really changes vastly the whole biblical scenario.
And what is calamus?
Calamus is a common marsh root that it grows in the Middle East. The references to Kaneh Bosem and Keneh specifically refer to an item of trade, so it's something that came from somewhere else. And the terms themselves, Keneh and Keneh Bosem, are Hebrew adoptions of an Indo-European name for cannabis, Kaneh. And this came in as an item of trade to the Hebrews. And in the first of these references, Exodus 30:23, God, who ironically appears to Moses in flames of fire from within a burning bush, commands Moses to make this holy anointing oil with about 9 pounds of this Kaneh Bosem, which is sometimes translated as fragrant grain, sometimes translated as calamus, mixed with myrrh and cinnamon into about 1.5 gallons of olive oil. And every time that Moses is to speak to the Lord, he goes into this enclosure called the tent of the meeting. He covers himself with this oil, and THC, the active ingredient in cannabis, is fatty soluble and can pass through the skin. And he places some of this oil on the incense altar, he burns it, and he speaks to the Lord in the pillar of smoke over the incense altar. The pillar of smoke is actually referred to as the Shekinah in Hebrew and refers to the physical presence of God. So Moses is only talking to God when there is smoke pouring out of the tent of the meeting. So when you throw cannabis into that...
So you're saying Moses was a pothead, basically?
Yeah, well, basically I'm saying that Moses was like a shaman who, like shamans in South America and Africa, often ingest psychoactive plants and then interpret the experience they have from those psychoactive plants as some sort of spiritual revelation.
So tell me about this legal case. You're contending that as a Christian, I assume you're a Christian?
Well, I'm more of like, I guess, a neo-Gnostic, Gnostic Christian kind of. I don't know how much you know about ancient Christianity, but I'd kind of fall into that class. I don't believe in things like virgin birth or the resurrection.
So you're using the Bible as the Christian Bible as a reference, the Christian and the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Yeah, definitely
as
a reference.
Saying that's somehow relevant to you.
Yeah, it is definitely relevant to me. I do believe that cannabis is the tree of life, and I'm a part of a church that recognizes cannabis as the tree of life. And people all across North America are starting to recognize cannabis as the tree of life.
Well, so let's step back a minute. Tree of life. Define that term.
Well, it appears in two places in the Bible, the beginning of the Bible in the Garden of Eden alongside the tree of knowledge, and these are forbidden. And at the end of the Bible, where a figure in the Bible, an angel, says that I will give to you to eat from the tree which is in the midst of the garden. And then the last paragraph on the Bible, Revelations 22, reads, on either side of the river of life stood the tree of life, bearing 12 manners of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. And 20 years ago, I read that verse, and just shortly after, I'd found out about industrial hemp and medicinal marijuana and a number of these applications. And when I read that, I had this religious revelation that cannabis was that tree of life, and I started thinking about people like Bob Marley and some of these Rastafarian groups that were pointing out to the same thing, and I'd never really thought about it before. And then shortly after having this experience, I found out about a church in Ontario, the Church of the Universe, which recognizes cannabis as a tree of life and has done so since 1969. And I joined that church, and I've been a reverend with that church. And that church has suffered through tremendous legal persecution, and currently the founders of the church, Brother Walter and Brother Michael, are in Ontario jail for half an ounce of cannabis.
So it's as part of this church that you contend that you have you should have the legal right to grow and smoke marijuana. So tell me about the case.
Well, basically what we did is myself and my lawyer, Kirk Tusaw, we wrote the health minister and asked for an exemption 56 for the spiritual use of cannabis, outlining my history and background. And exemption 56s were what the medical marijuana was granted under prior to the medical marijuana program we have here federally in Canada. And also through other people, we understand that the government has granted such a religious exemption for a very powerful psychoactive substance known as ayahuasca, which is a visionary tea from the Amazon basin. So there's been these precedents set with medical marijuana and this possibly this ayahuasca thing, which we're trying to find out more about. So basically, we're asking the health minister to extend that exemption process that they have for medical marijuana to include spiritual users like myself. And this was refused. The refusal opens it up to a judicial review of the justice minister's decision, where we can bring up all the charter issues of freedom of religion in court, which is very hard to do in criminal cases because criminal cases happen provincially, and it's been very unsuccessful so far, although numbers of people have tried to take the religious issue into federal court. And this will be the first time that these issues are dealt with in federal court.
I know that in the United States, perhaps there haven't been analogous cases here, but in the United States, First Nations groups, or Native Americans, as they're called in the States, have argued the use of peyote as part of
They have a federal exemption in the United States. In case of marijuana in the United States, they say that it's, because of the greater public interest, they're not going to extend that to cannabis. In Canada, what happened with peyote is they decided to leave it completely off the schedule. Peyote is not a scheduled substance, although the active chemical mescaline is. They left it off of the schedule because they were concerned if they created an exemption for people like in the Native American church, this may open it up to Rastafarians and other groups going for a religious exemption. So they thought they would bypass that precedent by doing that. In the case of Canada, my request was refused based on public interest. The idea that somehow my use of spiritual cannabis is a problem for the greater good, but we have the medical marijuana program in place, and the greater public interest has still been served.
Right. Great. Well, listen, there's a lot more to talk about. More with Chris Bennett when The Standard returns.